The first truck smelled like bourbon. Long before it turned into Margaret Hale's driveway, she could smell the rich aroma of charred white oak drifting through the morning air. The truck driver climbed down smiling. "You still taking them?" Margaret nodded. "I am." He looked at the towering trailer. 900 barrels over the next few years. "I've got room." The driver laughed. "Most folks think we're crazy. So do most folks." Moments later, dozens of worn whiskey barrels rolled gently onto the gravel lot beside her equipment shed. Some still carried faded Distillery stamps. Others wore rusty steel hoops. Every barrel was scarred, darkened by years of aging bourbon. The Distillery considered them finished. Margaret saw the beginning of something else. She simply hadn't figured out exactly what. The arrangement had begun almost by accident. The Hale farm bordered one of the oldest family-owned whiskey distilleries in the state. Every year, hundreds of American white oak barrels completed their aging cycle. Industry rules required fresh barrels for new whiskey. The old ones had value, but not enough. Shipping them elsewhere cost nearly as much as they were worth. Storage became expensive. Disposal became frustrating. One autumn afternoon, the distillery owner drove onto Margaret's farm. He removed his hat. "I've got a strange question." Margaret smiled. "I usually like those." He pointed toward the distillery. "We're drowning in used barrels." She nodded. "I've noticed. You've got an used ground behind your hay barn." "I do." He looked almost embarrassed. "Would you mind if we stored barrels there?" Margaret glanced toward the rocky hillside. Nothing grew well there. Too steep for crops. Too rough for grazing. "If you don't mind looking at them." She smiled. "I don't." Neither realized that handshake would quietly create an entirely new business. Every few weeks another truck arrived. 20 barrels. Sometimes 50. Occasionally 100. Year after year. The pile grew. Barrels stacked 3 and 4 high. Their weathered oak slowly silvering beneath the sun. Neighbors noticed almost immediately. Naturally. One Saturday morning, Dale Harper leaned against the feed mill porch. "There goes Margaret." Rick looked up. "The whiskey lady?" Several farmers laughed. Dale nodded. "How many barrels she collecting now?" Another rancher smiled. "Enough to float down the Mississippi." The laughter spread. Margaret climbed out of her pickup, carrying mineral blocks. Dale called across the parking lot. "So," she smiled. "So, you opening a saloon?" She laughed. "No." "What then?" "I don't know yet." More laughter. At least she was honest. Samuel Hale would have appreciated that answer. When Margaret was 16, he brought home an old apple crate missing half its boards. Margaret frowned. "Why keep that?" Samuel smiled. "Because I don't know what it'll become." She looked confused. "You usually have a plan." "Not always." He ran one hand across the weathered wood. "The trick isn't knowing. Silence. It's learning to recognize good material before you know the destination." Years later, standing among hundreds of whiskey barrels, Margaret finally understood. She wasn't collecting barrels. She was collecting possibilities. One rainy afternoon, she cut apart her first barrel. The process proved harder than expected. The steel hooks sprang loose. The curved oak staves scattered across the workshop. Nathan stepped inside just in time to watch one hoop roll across the floor. "Well," Margaret laughed. "That could have gone better." Nathan picked up one oak stave. Dark whiskey stains ran deep into the wood. The inside remained black from years of charring. He smelled it. "It still smells like bourbon." Margaret smiled. "So does the whole shop." She studied the curved pieces carefully. Solid American white oak. Exceptionally slow-grown. Perfectly seasoned. Impossible to buy new for the price she had paid. Actually, she hadn't paid anything. The barrels were free. That realization stayed with her. During winter evenings, Margaret began studying furniture design. Not ordinary furniture. Pieces that celebrated the barrel rather than hiding it. Coffee tables. Wine cabinets. Rocking chairs. Bookshelves. Console tables. Nathan walked into the house, carrying firewood. Margaret sat surrounded by sketches. Books. Old woodworking magazines. He smiled. "You're doing it again." She looked up. "What?" "The books." Silence. "The books. They always mean another project." Margaret laughed. "I think you're right." She enrolled in weekend woodworking classes 60 miles away. Most students built square cabinets. Perfect boxes. Straight shelves. Margaret brought curved barrel staves. The instructor raised an eyebrow. "You planning something unusual?" She smiled. "I hope so." The learning curve proved steep. Barrel wood resisted ordinary techniques. Every stave curved differently. Every hoop measured slightly differently. Nothing fit like ordinary lumber. The first barrel chair collapsed. The second rocked unevenly. The third split during assembly. Nathan quietly stacked every failure in the equipment shed. You saving all of these? Margaret nodded. Their tuition. By the 10th project, everything changed. A whiskey barrel coffee table. Glass top. Original steel hoops. Rich oak grain polished until it glowed. It looked unlike anything sold in furniture stores. The distillery owner happened to stop by that afternoon. He walked around the finished table twice, then smiled. That's one of my barrels. Margaret nodded. It was. He laughed. I've never seen one like this. Neither had anyone else. The county craft fair arrived that autumn. Margaret rented a small corner booth. 1-barrel coffee table. 2 stools. A wine cabinet. A side table. Visitors stopped constantly. People touched the smooth oak. Ran fingers across the weathered steel hoops. Leaned close to smell the faint bourbon aroma still trapped inside the wood. One customer whispered, "It actually smells like whiskey." Margaret smiled. It spent years making it. By closing time, she had sold only 1 piece. Nathan helped load everything back into the trailer. You disappointed? Margaret shook her head. They looked. So. They'll remember. A month later, an upscale restaurant called. The owner had seen photographs from the craft fair. He wanted custom barrel tables for a new bourbon lounge. Could Margaret build 12? She hesitated, then smiled. Yes. The project consumed nearly 3 months. Every table used original barrel heads engraved with authentic distillery markings. Each top carried its own history. Customers immediately noticed. The restaurant became famous almost overnight. Social media photographs spread across the region. People came as much to see the furniture as the food. Then something unexpected happened. Interior designers started calling. Not restaurants. Homes. Luxury cabins. Mountain lodges. Private wine cellars. Everyone wanted authentic barrel furniture. One afternoon, the distillery owner returned. This time he walked into a workshop buzzing with activity. Employees sanded oak. Welders shaped steel bases. Finished tables waited beside loading docks. He looked around quietly, then back toward the endless stacks of discarded barrels outside. Finally, he smiled. You know something? Margaret looked up. What? We've been paying people to haul away your inventory. She laughed. It certainly seems that way. A week later, a nationally known lodge designer drove nearly 400 miles to visit the farm. He spent hours examining every finished piece. Finally, he walked outside. Rows upon rows of weathered whiskey barrels stretched toward the tree line. He rested one hand on one of them, then turned toward Margaret. I've got a question. She folded her arms. Go ahead. The designer smiled. Have you ever considered creating furniture for luxury resorts across the country? The designer's question stayed with Margaret long after he drove away. Have you ever considered creating furniture for luxury resorts across the country? She hadn't. Not seriously. Her small workshop already had more orders than she could comfortably finish. Samuel always warned against chasing growth faster than craftsmanship. Still, the idea refused to disappear. Nathan noticed immediately. One evening he walked into the workshop carrying shipping invoices. Margaret sat studying maps of freight routes. He smiled. You're doing it again. She looked up. What? The maps. Silence. The maps. They usually mean you're about to make life more complicated. Margaret laughed. They usually do. 6 months later, she accepted her first national commission. A luxury mountain resort in Colorado wanted 20 handcrafted whiskey barrel coffee tables, matching lobby consoles, and custom dining tables for private guest lodges. The order was larger than anything she had attempted. Every piece had to match in quality, yet every piece needed to remain unique. Margaret refused to copy designs. Each barrel carried its own story, its own grain, its own whiskey stains, its own imperfections. That individuality became the centerpiece of every project. The workshop expanded carefully, not into a factory, into a team. Margaret hired retired cabinet makers, a young welder fresh out of trade school, a Finnish carpenter whose family farm had recently closed. Every employee spent weeks learning her methods before touching customer furniture. Nathan walked through the shop one morning. The sound of sanders echoed softly. Steel sparks flashed from the welding area. Fresh oak filled the air with a sweet aroma mixed with lingering whiskey. He smiled. It still smells like bourbon. Margaret laughed. I don't think that ever goes away. The Colorado shipment arrived safely. A month later, the resort opened. Travel photographers filled the lobby. Guests posted photographs online. Surprisingly, many pictures focused on the furniture. One travel magazine published an article featuring the lodge. Half the photographs highlighted Margaret's barrel tables. The caption beneath one image read, "Every table carries the character of a barrel that once aged Kentucky bourbon." The article spread quickly. Phone calls multiplied. Boutique hotels, luxury ranches, private vineyards, architects designing lake houses. Everyone wanted authentic barrel furniture. Nathan entered the office carrying another stack of contracts. "We've got another problem." Margaret smiled. "What?" "The waiting list." She opened the folder. 18 months. Then 22. Then nearly 2 years. She quietly closed it. "We're not rushing." Nathan nodded. "I know." That decision surprised many customers. Margaret refused mass production. She limited how many commissions they accepted each year. Quality stayed exactly where Samuel would have wanted it. One spring morning, the distillery owner returned with unexpected news. He climbed out of his truck, carrying several old photographs. "You should see these." Margaret spread them across the workbench. Black and white images. Workers rolling brand new barrels into aging warehouses decades earlier. One picture caught her attention. The serial number stamped into a barrel looked familiar. Very familiar. She hurried outside, walked through rows of stored barrels. Stopped. There it was. The exact same barrel. Still standing. Still waiting. More than 60 years later. The distillery owner smiled. "That barrel helped age bourbon before either of us were born." Margaret gently ran her hand across the weathered oak. "Then it deserves another life." From that day forward, every finished piece included a small brass plaque underneath. It recorded the barrel's original distillery, its filling year, its retirement year, the craftsman who built the furniture. Customers loved knowing the history. One hotel owner wrote, "Guests flipped the tables over just to read the story." Margaret laughed when she read the letter. Samuel would have appreciated that. The biggest surprise came from the distillery itself. Its marketing director approached Margaret with an unusual proposal. "What if?" He paused. "We sold your furniture in our visitor center?" Margaret looked surprised. "You mean inside the distillery?" He nodded. "People come here looking for authentic craftsmanship." He smiled. "So do your customers." Within months, visitors toured the aging warehouses, then walked into a showroom displaying handcrafted barrel furniture. Watching the process fascinated them. One display showed a worn whiskey barrel beside the finished coffee table created from it. People gathered around constantly. Many couldn't believe both pieces were the same wood. One visitor whispered, "It still smells like bourbon." Margaret smiled. "It probably always will." The partnership transformed both businesses. The distillery no longer paid to dispose of old barrels. Instead, retired barrels became one of its most valuable byproducts. Visitors specifically asked whether a barrel could become furniture after finishing its whiskey service. The answer became part of every tour. A business magazine eventually featured the collaboration. The headline covered 2 full pages. From whiskey barrel to heirloom furniture. The article reached designers across the country. Orders arrived from California, Texas, Maine, Montana. Luxury restaurants commissioned dining rooms. Corporate offices ordered conference tables. Private collectors requested one-of-a-kind statement pieces. Annual revenue quietly passed 6 figures. Then 7. Margaret rarely discussed the numbers. She cared more about the work. One autumn afternoon, Dale Harper visited the workshop. He slowly walked between finished pieces awaiting shipment. Barrel rocking chairs, executive desks, dining tables, wine cabinets, bookshelves. Everything handcrafted. Everything different. He stopped beside an enormous conference table built from 12 carefully matched barrel heads. The polished oak reflected warm afternoon sunlight. Dale shook his head. "I remember laughing." Margaret smiled. "I remember too." He rested one hand on the tabletop. "I thought those barrels belonged in a burn pile. So did most people." Silence. They were inventory. They always were. Later that year, a famous hotel chain commissioned furniture for 15 bourbon-themed restaurants nationwide. The project became the workshop's largest contract. Instead of outsourcing production, Margaret trained more local craftsmen. Young people who once planned to leave the county stayed. The workshop created dozens of skilled jobs. Nearby hardware stores expanded. Steel suppliers hired additional workers. Even local trucking companies benefited. The business lifted far more than Margaret's farm. The county economic development director visited during the final shipment. He watched employees carefully loading handcrafted furniture into climate-controlled trailers, then smiled. You know what you've really built? Margaret looked curious. What? A manufacturing company? She shook her head. No. What then? A craftsmanship company. There was a difference. One focused on speed. The other focused on legacy. The director smiled. I think you're right. One quiet evening, Nathan stood beside Margaret, overlooking the rows of remaining whiskey barrels stacked beneath the setting sun. Hundreds still waited. Some weathered. Some nearly black with age. Each one looked ordinary. Until someone looked closer. Nathan folded his arms. You know what still amazes me? Margaret smiled. What? They gave these away. Yes. For years. I know. He looked toward the workshop where lights still glowed through the windows. Everyone saw empty barrels. Margaret walked over and rested one hand on an old oak stave. The wood remained solid. Rich. Beautiful. She smiled softly. They weren't empty. Nathan looked puzzled. What do you mean? They were full. Full of what? She looked across the workshop where another dining table was receiving its final coat of finish. Stories. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of charred oak and aged bourbon across the farm. Years earlier, truck after truck had unloaded retired whiskey barrels behind Margaret Hale's hay barn because nobody believed they had much value left. The distillery saw storage costs. Neighbors saw junk. Most people saw old barrels waiting to rot. Margaret saw seasoned white oak, remarkable craftsmanship, and generations of history hidden beneath weathered steel hoops. She never tried to erase the barrel's past. She polished it, preserved it, built around it. By the time her furniture filled luxury resorts, designer homes, and boutique hotels across the country, people praised her creativity. Margaret quietly disagreed. She believed the Coopers who built those barrels decades earlier had already created something extraordinary. She simply refused to let their work end when the whiskey was gone. And in the end, the greatest thing the distillery ever dumped behind her farm wasn't 900 old barrels. It was 900 second chances, each one waiting patiently for someone willing to see that the finest craftsmanship often begins where everyone else believes the story is already over.